in-between is where I live. If Justice Sonia Sotomayor is a wise Latina, I am a not-so-wise in-betweener. I'm the daughter of a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant man who fell in love at first sight with a black Haitian-American woman. They married in the year of our Lord, 1958, a time when our nation's judges could write opinions upholding anti-miscegenation statutes like, and I quote, Almighty God made the races, white, black, yellow, Malay, and red, and he placed them on separate continents. But for the interference with this arrangement, there would be no cause for such marriages. The fact that he separated the races shows that he did not intend for them to mix. But they did, Blanche. Wake up and smell the cafe au lait. I grew up during the 60s and 70s, and people asked me, oh, wasn't that hard? Not in our house. It was a multicultural festival. Christmas Eve, dancing the merengue with my mother between sips of rum punch as the relatives discussed heatedly Haitian politics. Christmas luncheon at my beloved paternal grandmother's house, roast beef, Yorkshire pudding. The adults heatedly discussed the crossword puzzle. My mother had a ritual. Every night, she would waltz me around to every mirror in the house before putting me to bed. As an adult, I realized this wasn't just an exercise in narcissism. It was her way of ensuring that I saw myself clearly in a world that might try to convince me that I was the child of a lesser God. My father held up the mirror of history, our families and the world's. He reminded us that race was a social construct, not a scientific reality, and that the so-called races had been shagging each other since the dawn of time. We are all in-betweenos. So I was well prepared when, in the 7th grade, we were studying Harper Lee's masterpiece, To Kill a Mockingbird. And I pointed out to the teacher that Atticus Finch, though noble and courageous and just, held a rather condescending, if not racist, point of view of blacks, frequently referring to the Negro's ignorance and simplicity and holding up his cook Calpurnia as the lone exception to this rule. That was true of the blacks at the time, my teacher replied. Wow, all of them? I guess she'd taken a poll, perfected time travel, and gone door to door in 1935 Alabama. I didn't bother arguing. Even at 12, I knew she was tragically misinformed. I knew because my father had chosen to adorn the walls of his study, not with the portraits of his own distinguished Anglo-Saxon ancestors, but with black historical figures. No, not those depressing abolitionist prints of kneeling naked Negroes begging Wilberforce, Lincoln, anybody to free them. No, men of intellect, agency, and power. Toussaint Louverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines. You've got to admit, he's rocking that Napoleonic hat. And you've got to be cute to rock one of those. They stared at me every day when I came home from school. And my father was my Atticus Finch. To be sure, a bit more of a drinker, and, as my mother subtly implied, something of a womanizer. She would often laughingly recount the story of standing on a subway platform not long after they wed and seeing a man on the opposing platform make eyes at her. Recognizing her new husband, she smiled and waved. From his horrified expression, she realized he hadn't recognized her at all and thought he was hitting on a stranger. But none of that mattered in the glowing haze of childhood. Emotionally shy, my father didn't dandle me on his knee and cover me with kisses. Instead, He shared his passion for all the world's culture, for literature, for languages. He didn't take me to Disneyland so I could walk around with a plastic tiara on my head. He crowned me with knowledge at museums. The Met was one of our stomping grounds. There, I could contemplate images like my Inbetween brother, Juan de Pareja, the mulatto assistant to Velázquez, a painter in his own right, and further proof, shagging each other for centuries. More than anything, my father adored my mother, frequently reminding me that she was a queen and the love of his life. He carried her story and her history more proudly than his own. Childhood. Then I saw through a glass darkly. Adulthood brought me face to face with less pretty truths. When I was 22, my father left my mother for a 21-year-old African woman he'd met in a cafe. He moved to Paris, still protesting my mother was the love of his life and never divorcing her. There was a succession of amours until several years after my mother died, when I was well into middle age, I received an invitation to my then 80-year-old father's marriage to a woman 50 years his junior. The wedding was to take place in Paris and include a disco portion of the evening. I did not want to attend. Ringling Brothers, after all, was a mere subway ride away. My husband prodded me gently, telling me he obviously really wants you there. I chose not to bring my then 5-year-old daughter. I wanted to use the time on the plane to reflect and write my children's book, Mommy, Where Do 20-year-old Stepmothers Come From? But really, at the end of the day, age was not the issue. Goodness knows, I hope when I'm 80, I can pull a 30-year-old. It will never happen. I will be the first woman in the Guinness Book of World Records, but a girl can dream. The hottie and the crone. No, the real issue was looking around at the various receptions and realizing that my father was virtually the lone white man in a bevy of nubile, young black women, most of them African immigrants. I found one of the bride's friends rooting around the living room couch in search of an earring misplaced the night before. I didn't want to know how. Another, endowed with a beautifully ample posterior, giddily told me my father had dubbed her Tibunda, which is Creole for little butt. TMI, Tibunda. I suddenly had the discomforting feeling of being in the midst of a neo-colonialist seraglio. Was my father nothing more than a fetishist? I had fought that narrative all my life, arguing with skeptical people of color who would say to me, no white man can ever love a black woman in America as an equal, only exploit her. No, I'd insisted. My parents' marriage had nothing to do with power politics or color. It was just two human beings. But was it? Suddenly, the subway platform story wasn't so funny. When a man has lived by truth, and you have believed in what he has lived, he does not just leave you wary when he fails you. He leaves you with nothing. These are the words of the grown scout, Jean Louise, from Harper Lee's recently published Go Set a Watchman. These are her thoughts upon discovering that Atticus Finch, her father, her moral compass, is an arch segregationist. Readers have reacted with a shock and horror and sense of betrayal equal to Scout's. Et tu, Gregory Peck. People are renaming their children mid-toddlerhood. You're not Atticus anymore, honey, you're Luke, the politically correct apostle. Don't throw your sippy cup at me. One critic has gone as far as to insist that the Atticus Finch, who in Watchmen attends a white citizen council's meeting, is not the Atticus Finch who in To Kill a Mockingbird defends a black man falsely accused of rape. But it is the same Atticus Finch. It is the Atticus Finch who, in To Kill a Mockingbird, scolds Scout for using the word nigger, not because it's derogatory, but because it's common. It is the Atticus Finch who, in describing the white Mayella Ewell's attempted seduction of the black Tom Robinson, describes it as breaking a time-honored code of our society, a code with which he does not quarrel. And the man before me at the wedding, my father, surrounded by a bevy of fawning young black women, is the same man who told me my mother was a queen and that there was only one race, the human race. I wanted to look away, to forget what I had seen, but to refuse to face my father's contradictions, his in-between, would make me no different from all those who to this day refuse to accept that our founding father, Thomas Jefferson, had children with Sally Hemings, his slave and sister-in-law. She was his wife's half-sister. One historian has gone as far as to say, in spite of the DNA evidence, that such a relationship was a moral impossibility. What do we think the man was doing for 44 years of widowhood? Polishing the wood for his moldboard plow? No, he was doing what every other planter was doing, exercising his rights over his property. And maybe, if I had been a white man in the 18th century, I would have done the same, and maybe you would too. It is the refusal to accept our complexity as individuals or as groups that keeps our house divided against itself. History is therapy for nations. If you lie your way through therapy, you will remain mentally ill. And if we, as a nation, do not face our history honestly, without shame or blame, it will continue to bite us in the tibunda. Thomas Jefferson, as a young attorney, defended mixed-race slaves suing their masters for freedom. Thomas Jefferson, as master of Monticello, kept his own mixed-race children in bondage until his death. In extolling the superiority of white beauty, Thomas Jefferson claimed that blacks preferred whites, and I quote, as uniformly as is the preference of the orangutan for the black women over the females of his own species. He is also the poet-statesman who wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and laid the cornerstone of our enduring democracy." Atticus Finch was a gentleman and a racist who risked his life in the futile pursuit of justice for a black man in the Jim Crow South. Atticus Finch was a father who loved his daughter enough to raise her to think for herself. As I face the disillusionment with my own Atticus, I recalled one of my mother's final conversations with my father shortly before she died. He was railing against America's treatment of minorities, mainly black men. She, as a black woman who had arguably suffered a little bit more from this system than he had, patiently listened and finally said, "I love America with all its faults, just as I love you with all of yours." No one can be reduced to one identity, and no one should be judged solely by their worst trait or dumbest statement. Orangutans, Mr. Jefferson, he was in Virginia. Where did he even see an orangutan, much less one in hot pursuit of a black woman? I think we can conclude he was high on the Monticello claret. To paraphrase the playwright August Wilson, when we look at another person, we often see just a line on the horizon. But no one is just a line. We are all whole worlds. I am the daughter of a complex man who fell in love at first sight with an equally complex woman. Through the mad, passionate, tortured, and beautiful dance of their marriage, they taught me to seek commonality in the face of apparent difference, and where there is conflict, to ask a simple question. I'm trying to see you. Do you want to see me?